My name is Harper Sinclair. I'm 32 years old, and I was standing in the shadowed corner of a five-star hotel ballroom in Manhattan, watching my father marry a woman young enough to be my sister. The chandeliers sparkled overhead, white orchids cascaded from every surface, and 300 guests in designer clothes sipped champagne worth more than most people's monthly rent. Then my father, Richard Sinclair, stepped to the microphone and introduced me, not as his daughter, but as the housekeeper who helped prepare this wedding. My fingers tightened around my leather clutch, feeling the legal documents inside that proved I owned 40% of his $700 million company. I smiled coldly, knowing this was the moment when my father and his new family would learn who truly held the power. Before we dive into what happened next, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, hit that like button. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this story gets wild, and you will not want to miss how I made them all pay for underestimating me. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. 6 months before that humiliating wedding introduction, I was living what most people would call a successful life. I worked as marketing director at a prestigious advertising firm in New York, pulling in a solid six-figure salary, living in a decent apartment in Brooklyn, and slowly rebuilding myself after losing my mother, Catherine, to cancer 3 years earlier. Mom's death had gutted me in ways I still could not fully articulate, leaving a hollow space in my chest that never quite filled back in. She had been my anchor, my confidant, the parent who actually saw me as a person rather than an accessory to their life. My father, Richard, had always been distant, consumed by his work running Sinclair Industries, a manufacturing company my grandfather founded in the 1950s. After Mom died, that distance grew into a chasm so wide I stopped trying to bridge it. He buried himself deeper into work, attended endless business dinners, and barely acknowledged my existence beyond obligatory holiday phone calls that felt more like checking items off a to-do list than actual conversation. Then one Tuesday morning in March, I received a call from Bernard Matthews, the family attorney who had handled my parents' legal affairs for decades. His voice carried that careful professional tone lawyers use when they are about to upend your entire world. He asked me to come to his office in Midtown, said it was regarding my mother's estate, and refused to elaborate over the phone. I sat in his mahogany-paneled office 2 days later, my palms sweating despite the aggressive air conditioning, while Bernard slid a manila envelope across his desk. Inside were documents that made my hands shake as I read them. My mother had spent 20 years quietly, methodically purchasing shares of Sinclair Industries, using her inheritance from my maternal grandparents, a old-money Boston family with generational wealth that made even my father's success look modest. She had been strategic, buying small amounts through various investment vehicles and trusts, never enough at once to draw attention or trigger disclosure requirements, always staying just under the radar. By the time she passed away, she owned 40% of the company, and she left every single share to me. The attached letter, written in my mother's elegant cursive handwriting, explained everything in a way that made my heart crack open all over again. She had known about my father's affair with Vivian Walsh, his assistant, for 15 years. She detailed how she discovered them together at a supposed business conference in Chicago, how she sat in their hotel lobby and watched them return from dinner holding hands, how something inside her died that night, but she made the calculated decision not to confront him immediately. Instead, she began her quiet campaign of financial protection, understanding that Richard would eventually leave her, or worse, stay in a hollow marriage while flaunting his mistress. She wanted to ensure I would never be vulnerable, never be at the mercy of my father's whims or his gold-digging girlfriend's schemes. The letter ended with words that still echo in my mind during sleepless nights, telling me to be strong, to be smart, and to never let anyone make me feel less than worthy. She gave me power, but more importantly, she taught me that love sometimes looks like preparation for the worst possible outcome. I spent the next week in a daze, barely able to process this information while maintaining my facade at work. I owned 40% of a company worth approximately $700 million. Making my shares worth around $280 million. The legal structure my mother created meant the ownership was held through a trust with my name carefully obscured behind layers of corporate entities, so Richard had no idea his dead wife had outmaneuvered him so completely. The terms of the trust gave me total control but allowed me to remain anonymous as a shareholder until I chose to reveal myself. I could attend board meetings through a proxy, receive financial reports, and technically had enough voting power to block major decisions, all while my father believed he still ran his kingdom unchallenged. I decided to wait, to observe, to see what kind of man my father truly was when he thought no one was watching. That decision led me to discover horrors far beyond a simple affair. The relationship between my father and me had been deteriorating since before Mom's death. If I am being honest with myself, he had always been emotionally unavailable. The kind of father who showed love through expensive birthday gifts rather than actual presents, who missed dance recitals and graduation ceremonies because of urgent business meetings that probably could have waited. After Mom died, he did not even pretend anymore. 6 months after her funeral, he started bringing Vivian to family events, this blonde woman in her early 30s with a practiced smile and designer clothes that my father clearly paid for. When I asked him privately if he thought it was too soon, if maybe he should grieve his wife of 30 years before parading around with someone new, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said it was not my concern how he lived his life. That was the moment I realized my father did not see me as his daughter anymore, if he ever really had. I was just another person who wanted something from him, another obligation to manage and minimize. The first official dinner where I met Vivian Walsh as my father's girlfriend rather than just his assistant happened on a rainy October evening. Richard invited me to his penthouse, the same apartment where I grew up, where my mother had decorated every room with care and filled the space with warmth, despite my father's cold corporate aesthetic. Walking in that night felt like entering a museum dedicated to erasing my mother's existence. Vivian had redecorated everything. Gone were the soft cream walls and family photos, replaced with stark white paint and modern art that looked expensive but soulless. My mother's antique furniture had vanished, substituted with angular pieces that prioritized appearance over comfort. Even the smell was different. My mother's preferred lavender sachets replaced by whatever aggressively floral perfume Vivian bathed in. Vivian herself greeted me at the door wearing a Chanel dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent, dripping in diamond jewelry, playing hostess in my dead mother's home like she had earned that right. She called me sweetie and honey in this syrupy voice that made my skin crawl, touching my arm with fake familiarity while steering me toward the living room. Throughout dinner, she dominated the conversation, talking about her childhood in some small town in Connecticut, her business degree from a state school she clearly felt insecure about, and how she had helped Richard through the darkest period of his life. That last part made me grip my fork hard enough to leave marks in my palm. The darkest period of his life? My mother died. He lost his wife of 3 decades. But according to Vivian's revisionist history, the real tragedy was how difficult it had been for poor Richard to cope. And thank goodness Vivian was there to support him. She kept making these subtle digs about how my mother did not understand Richard like she did, how Catherine was lovely but too traditional, too focused on home and family instead of being a true partner in his ambitions. I watched my father nod along, not even defending my mother's memory, and I wanted to throw my wine glass at both of them. But what really caught my attention that night was a conversation they had over dessert about business. Vivian mentioned a restructuring plan, talking about how Richard needed to consider selling some of his shares to diversify his portfolio. She had this friend, she said, a brilliant investment manager named Derek Walsh, who ran an exclusive fund for high-net-worth individuals. Derek could get Richard into opportunities that would double his money in 5 years, but it required liquid capital, which meant selling a significant stake in Sinclair Industries. My father listened intently, asking questions about returns and structure, while I sat there realizing I was watching a con unfold in real time. The way Vivian described this fund was textbook too good to be true, promising guaranteed returns that no legitimate investment could offer, and the fact that the fund manager shared her last name was not a coincidence I intended to ignore. I said nothing, just smiled politely and took mental notes, already planning to have this Derek Walsh investigated. After that dinner, Vivian started calling me regularly. These intrusive phone calls where she pretended to care about my life while actually fishing for information. She would ask about my job, my salary, whether I had a boyfriend, what my plans were for the future, all delivered in that same condescending, sweetie voice that made me want to hang up immediately. But I played along, giving her just enough information to seem cooperative, while feeding her carefully constructed lies about my finances. I told her I was barely scraping by in New York, that advertising did not pay as well as people thought, that I had student loans and credit card debt. I wanted her to think I was struggling, vulnerable, someone who posed no threat to whatever schemes she was running. Meanwhile, I hired a private investigator to look into both Vivian and Derek Walsh, spending $5,000 of my own money to uncover what I suspected would be a very ugly truth. The investigation came back 2 weeks later with a report that confirmed my worst fears and then some. Derek Walsh had been involved in 3 failed business ventures over the past decade, each one leaving investors with significant losses, while Derek somehow walked away unscathed. He had been sued twice for fraud but settled both cases out of court, with non-disclosure agreements. His current investment fund was not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission, operated out of a virtual office in Delaware, and had all the hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme. Vivian, meanwhile, had a history of dating wealthy older men, each relationship ending with her substantially richer than when it began. Before my father, there was a real estate developer in Stamford who gave her a condo when they broke up, and before him, a divorced hedge fund manager who paid off her student loans and bought her a car. She was a professional gold digger with a criminal brother, and they had targeted my father like sharks, circling wounded prey. What hurt most during this period was watching my father pull further and further away from me. He forgot my birthday for the first time in my life, something my mother would never have let happen. When I reminded him 3 days later, he sent an expensive handbag via courier with a card signed by his secretary. He canceled our annual dinner commemorating my mother's death because he and Vivian had planned a trip to Napa Valley. When I called him out, asking if he could reschedule his vacation to honor the woman he was married to for 30 years, he sighed heavily and told me I needed to stop living in the past. He actually said those words to me. Stop living in the past. As if grieving my mother was some inconvenient hobby I needed to outgrow. That was when I started to understand that the man I called father had been replaced by someone I did not recognize, someone Vivian had carefully sculpted into a version of himself that served her purposes. 3 months before the wedding, Vivian decided it was time for me to meet her family. She framed it as this casual Sunday brunch, just a chance for everyone to get acquainted, but I knew better. This was a power play, a way to show me that her people were infiltrating every corner of my father's life. I showed up at the penthouse to find Derek Walsh already there, sprawled on my mother's favorite couch like he owned the place, drinking scotch at 11 in the morning. He was everything the investigator's report suggested, a man with slicked back hair, an expensive suit that fit just a bit too perfectly, and eyes that calculated the value of everything they saw. He greeted me with a firm handshake and a smile that never reached his eyes, immediately launching into a pitch about his investment fund before I even had a chance to sit down. The audacity was almost impressive. Vivian's mother, Patricia Walsh, arrived shortly after, a woman in her 60s who had clearly spent a fortune on plastic surgery that left her face pulled too tight and her lips inflated to an unnatural size. She wore so much gold jewelry that she clinked when she walked, and she immediately began critiquing everything about the penthouse's decor, offering unsolicited advice about which pieces Vivian should replace next. When she turned her attention to me, her assessment was even less kind. She looked me up and down with obvious disapproval, commenting that I dressed very casually for a family brunch, even though I was wearing a perfectly nice sweater and jeans. Then she asked what I did for a living, and when I told her I worked in advertising, she made this dismissive sound and said that must be difficult, trying to make ends meet in such an unstable industry. The implication was clear that I was financially struggling, that I was lesser than them, that I did not belong in this world of wealth they were constructing around my father. Derek was worse. He kept making these cutting remarks disguised as jokes, saying I looked more like the help than the daughter of a CEO, asking if I had thought about going back to school since advertising was such a dead-end career. My father sat there through all of this and said nothing. He did not defend me, did not tell them to show me respect, just laughed along with their cruel humor like I was in on the joke instead of being the punchline. I excused myself to use the bathroom at one point, needing a moment away from their toxic presence, and when I walked past my father's study, I heard Derek and Vivian talking in low voices. I stopped outside the door, holding my breath, and listened to them discuss their plan with a casualness that made my blood run cold. Derek said that once the wedding was finalized, he would convince Richard to sell 30% of his Sinclair Industries shares to Derek's investment fund. He would pitch it as diversification, as smart financial planning, as a way to access better opportunities. The fund would pay Richard in installments, which would give them time to move the money through various accounts before disappearing. Derek actually laughed while describing how easy it would be to manipulate Richard, saying my father was so desperate for Vivian's approval that he would do anything she suggested. Vivian's response was even more chilling. She said that I was too stupid to suspect anything, that I was just a pathetic girl mourning her dead mother, and that even if I did figure something out, nobody would believe me because Richard did not even consider me his daughter anymore. She actually said that, said my father did not see me as his child. I stood there in the hallway, recording every word on my phone, feeling something inside me harden into steel. The attacks became more frequent after that. Someone tried to access my bank accounts, triggering fraud alerts that showed the login attempts came from an IP address registered to my father's building. I immediately moved all my money to new accounts at a different bank, set up two-factor authentication on everything, and hired a cybersecurity consultant to lock down my digital presence. Then my car was broken into outside my apartment, but nothing was stolen. Just my glove compartment ransacked and papers scattered. They were looking for something, probably financial documents or information they could use against me. I started keeping everything important in a safe deposit box and carried copies of my most critical documents with me at all times. I also reached out to Margaret Chen, an independent board member at Sinclair Industries who had been my mother's close friend. Margaret had always been skeptical of Richard's recent business decisions and did not hide her distaste for Vivian. When I called her and asked to meet privately, she agreed immediately. I met Margaret at a quiet restaurant in the village, somewhere I knew we would not run into anyone from my father's circle. I told her everything, showed her the documents proving my ownership stake, played her the recording of Derek and Vivian discussing their fraud scheme. Margaret listened with growing horror, her face paling when she heard how casually they planned to steal from the company. She confirmed what I suspected, that several recent decisions Richard made did not make sound business sense, that he had been pushing to liquidate assets and consolidate cash in ways that would make it easier to move large sums of money quickly. Margaret promised to help me when the time came to reveal my ownership, and she connected me with James Reed, another major shareholder who owned 20% of the company and had been increasingly concerned about Richard's erratic behavior. I was building my army, piece by piece, preparing for a war my father did not even know was coming. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, not hand-delivered with any personal note from my father, but sent through the mail like I was just another name on a guest list. The envelope was heavy cream cardstock with gold lettering, announcing the marriage of Richard Sinclair and Vivian Walsh at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. When I opened it, I found my name spelled incorrectly. Harper Sinclair, written as Harper Sinclair, and the +1 option that read and guessed, as if my father could not be bothered to remember whether I was seeing anyone. There was no personal message inside. No note from my father explaining his happiness or hoping I would be there to celebrate with him. Just a formal invitation identical to the 300 others they sent out, treating me exactly like a business acquaintance instead of his only child. I stared at that invitation for a long time, feeling the weight of my father's indifference settle over me like a heavy blanket. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to refuse to attend and let him wonder if I cared enough to show up. But I knew that was what they wanted. For me to disappear quietly, to make myself small and irrelevant so they could proceed with their plans without any interference. Instead, I called my father's number, the same cell phone he had owned for a decade, and waited through 4 rings before he picked up. His greeting was distracted, barely acknowledging who was calling, and when I mentioned the wedding invitation, he sounded surprised that I had received it already. I asked if there was anything I could do to help with the preparations, trying to sound like a dutiful daughter, and he dismissed me immediately. He said Vivian had hired the best wedding planner in New York and everything was under control, that I should not worry about it and just show up looking presentable. That phone call lasted less than 3 minutes. 3 minutes to discuss his wedding to a woman who was not my mother. 3 minutes where he could not even pretend to care about my feelings or acknowledge the massive life change he was making. I hung up, feeling hollow, but that hollowness quickly transformed into determination. 2 days later, Vivian called me with a request that was clearly designed to humiliate. Her voice was sugar-sweet as always when she asked if I would mind coming to the plaza the morning of the wedding to make sure everything was set up properly. She said she trusted my eye for detail, that it would mean so much to her if I could be there early to check that the florists did not mess up the arrangements, that the caterers had everything they needed, that the place settings were perfect. She was asking me to be her unpaid wedding coordinator, to serve her on what was supposed to be one of the most painful days of my life. I agreed, of course. I agreed because I knew exactly what game she was playing, and I had already decided that her wedding day would be when I burned her entire world to the ground. I spent the next few weeks preparing with the same meticulous attention my mother had taught me to apply to everything important. I contacted my lawyer, Benjamin Carter, and had him prepare all the legal documentation proving my ownership stake, every share certificate, every trust document, every piece of paper that established me as the largest shareholder of Sinclair Industries. I coordinated with Margaret Chen and James Reed to ensure they would both be at the Monday morning board meeting I had called, the one my father did not know about yet because it was my right as a major shareholder to convene such meetings, and I had used my proxy to do it anonymously. I hired a forensic accountant to compile a report on Derek Walsh's investment fund, documenting every red flag and every indication of fraud. I was preparing a nuclear bomb, and I planned to detonate it at the moment of maximum impact. I also discovered something that made the betrayal even deeper. While going through my father's public financial disclosures, which I had access to as a shareholder, I noticed that he had removed my name from his will 6 months ago. The old will, filed when my mother was still alive, left everything to be split between my mother and me. The new will, updated shortly after he started dating Vivian seriously, left everything to Vivian Walsh, with a token trust fund for me that would pay out $50,000 a year for 10 years and then dissolve. $500,000 total, from a man worth hundreds of millions. He had essentially written me out of his life in every way that mattered, reducing me to a minor beneficiary who would receive less than 1% of his estate. When I showed this to Benjamin, even he, a lawyer who had seen everything, looked shocked. He told me that I had every right to contest the will, that cutting out a biological child so drastically would raise questions, but I told him not to bother. I did not want my father's money from his will. I already had my inheritance from my mother, and it was worth far more than he could ever give me. I arrived at the Plaza Hotel at 7 in the morning, 3 hours before guests were scheduled to arrive. The grand ballroom had been transformed into a garden of white orchids, roses imported from Ecuador, and crystal chandeliers that reflected light in dazzling patterns across the floor. The space looked like something from a magazine spread, every detail perfect and luxurious and completely devoid of anything personal that connected to my father's actual life. This was Vivian's fantasy, a wedding designed to impress rather than celebrate any genuine love. I walked through the space in my simple black dress, the one I chose specifically to blend into the background, carrying my leather clutch that held documents worth more than this entire event. A few vendors were still setting up, adjusting chair covers and testing the sound system, and they barely glanced at me as I moved between the tables. Vivian arrived at 7:30 in a silk robe, her hair already styled in an elaborate updo that must have taken hours, her makeup dramatic enough for a Broadway stage. She immediately started barking orders at the wedding planner, a harried woman in her 40s who looked like she had not slept in days. Then Vivian spotted me, and her whole demeanor changed, becoming syrupy sweet again. She called me over, thanked me profusely for coming so early, and then proceeded to give me a list of tasks that would have been appropriate for a paid assistant. She wanted me to count the place settings to make sure they matched the guest list. She wanted me to go to the kitchen and verify that the caterers had the correct number of vegetarian meals. She wanted me to check that every bathroom had been stocked with the specific luxury hand soap she ordered. I did it all without complaint, playing the role she assigned me, watching her treat me like hired help while I mentally counted down the hours until her entire scheme collapsed. Guests started arriving at 10, and I positioned myself in a corner near the bar where I could observe without being noticed. They came in waves, wealthy business people in designer clothes, socialites who ran in my father's circles, politicians who benefited from his donations, all of them air-kissing and complimenting each other while servers circulated with champagne. The Walsh family arrived like they owned the place. Patricia dripping in diamonds, Derek with a new girlfriend on his arm who looked barely old enough to drink legally. They held court near the center of the room, laughing too loudly and drawing attention to themselves, basking in the reflected glory of marrying into the Sinclair fortune. I saw several of my father's business associates looking at them with barely concealed distaste, people who clearly recognized grifters when they saw them but were too polite to say anything. Then my father made his entrance, and I felt my chest tighten despite all my mental preparation. He looked handsome in his custom tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face glowing with happiness I had not seen since before my mother got sick. For just a moment, I wanted to be happy for him, wanted to believe that maybe he had found genuine love and deserved this second chance at happiness. But then I saw how he looked at Vivian when she appeared at the back of the ballroom in her wedding dress, a ridiculously expensive Vera Wang gown that cost more than most people's cars, and I knew this was not love. This was possession. He looked at her the way he looked at his vintage car collection or his expensive watch collection, like she was an acquisition that proved his worth. The ceremony was mercifully short, a generic script about love and partnership that could have applied to any couple. When the officiant pronounced them married, the guests applauded politely, and my father kissed his new bride with theatrical enthusiasm, while photographers captured every angle. Then came the reception, the endless toasts from people who barely knew either of them, the first dance to a song that had no particular meaning, the cutting of a 7-tier cake that looked better than it tasted. I stood in my corner, sipping water, waiting for the moment I knew was coming. It arrived about an hour into the reception, when my father decided to make rounds, thanking guests for attending. He moved from table to table with Vivian on his arm, shaking hands and accepting congratulations, working the room like the corporate executive he was. They approached a group of business associates I recognized, men who sat on the boards of other companies, who controlled millions in investment capital, who mattered in my father's world. One of them, a silver-haired man named Robert, gestured toward me and asked my father a question I could not hear from my position. I watched my father turn, look directly at me, and then turn back to Robert with a casual smile. His voice carried across the room clearly when he answered, and I will remember his exact words for the rest of my life. He said that I was Harper, the housekeeper who had been with the family for years, who had helped prepare this beautiful wedding and made sure everything ran smoothly. He thanked me publicly for my service, said Vivian could not have done it without my help, and never once mentioned that I was his daughter. The group nodded politely, not particularly interested, already moving on to other topics. But I stood frozen, feeling like I had been punched in the stomach, all the air sucked from my lungs. My father had just erased me from his life in front of 300 people, reduced me to domestic staff, made me invisible in the most public way possible. Vivian had heard the exchange, and I watched her face light up with vicious satisfaction before she caught herself and rearranged her features into a sympathetic expression. She broke away from my father and walked over to me, her wedding dress rustling, and leaned in close like she was sharing a confidence. She thanked me sweetly for all my hard work, said she knew how much effort I put into making her day perfect, and then she pressed an envelope into my hand. She told me it was a tip for my excellent service, that she knew I probably needed the extra money, and she was so grateful for everything I did. I opened the envelope later and found $200 in crisp bills. $200 as payment for being publicly humiliated and erased from my own father's life. I tucked the money back into the envelope, put it in my clutch next to the legal documents worth hundreds of millions, and walked out of the ballroom. I went down to the hotel lobby, found a quiet corner, and made 2 phone calls. The first was to Benjamin Carter, telling him to have all documentation ready for the Monday morning board meeting, that we were moving forward with the full reveal. The second was to my private investigator, instructing him to send all evidence about Derek Walsh's investment fraud to my lawyer, and to have a copy ready for the Securities and Exchange Commission. Then I sat in that lobby for 2 hours, breathing deeply, preparing myself for what came next. I went back up to the reception around sunset, when the party was reaching its peak. The DJ was playing loud music, guests were dancing. My father and Vivian were surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations and expensive gifts. I slipped out onto the outdoor terrace where some guests had gone to smoke cigars and escape the noise. I stood in the shadows, listening to conversations, and that was when I heard Derek Walsh talking to someone I recognized immediately, Glenn Morrison, the chief financial officer of Sinclair Industries. Glenn had worked for my family for 20 years, attended my birthday parties when I was a child, called himself Uncle Glenn, and brought me gifts at Christmas. My mother had trusted him completely, and now I listened to him conspire with a con artist to destroy the company my grandfather built. Derek's voice carried across the terrace as he described the final details of the investment scheme to Glenn. He explained how the fund worked, how it was structured to look legitimate on paper while being completely fraudulent underneath. He used terms like guaranteed returns and proprietary strategies that any actual financial professional would recognize as red flags, but he delivered them with such confidence that someone who wanted to believe would accept them without question. Glenn asked about the timeline, when Richard would be approached with the investment opportunity, and Derek laughed and said it would happen during the honeymoon. Vivian would bring it up casually, mention how Derek had this exclusive opportunity, and Richard would be so relaxed and happy that he would not scrutinize it too carefully. They planned to get his signature on preliminary documents before he sobered up and consulted with actual financial advisors. Then Derek mentioned the commission, telling Glenn that as soon as Richard signed over the shares and the money transferred to the investment fund, Glenn would receive 5% as his cut for facilitating everything from inside the company. 5% of whatever Richard invested, which based on their discussions would be somewhere around $200 million if they could convince him to sell 30% of his shares. That meant Glenn stood to make $10 million for betraying the company he helped build, for lying to my father, for participating in a fraud scheme that would inevitably collapse and leave Richard facing criminal liability. Glenn's response made me sick to my stomach. He thanked Derek, said he had been waiting for an opportunity like this for years, that he was tired of being the loyal employee while Richard made all the money. He said my father did not appreciate him, did not pay him what he was worth, and this was simply taking what he deserved. I stepped out of the shadows then, unable to stay silent any longer. Both men turned to stare at me, their faces registering shock and then calculation as they decided how to handle this unexpected witness. Glenn recovered first, forcing a smile and calling me by name, asking what I was doing out here on the terrace. I looked directly at him and asked how he could do this to my family, to my mother's memory, to the company that had provided his livelihood for 2 decades. His smile faltered and something ugly crossed his face, the mask slipping to reveal the resentment he had been hiding all these years. He told me I did not understand how business worked, that I was just a naive girl who thought the world was fair and people were loyal. He said my mother had been too soft, too trusting, and that my father was too arrogant to see what was right in front of him. He practically spat the words at me, years of buried anger finally surfacing. Derek Walsh intervened smoothly, stepping between us with his practiced charm. He suggested that I clearly misunderstood what I heard, that they were discussing a completely legitimate investment opportunity, and perhaps I should go back inside and enjoy the wedding instead of eavesdropping on private business conversations. His tone was condescending, dismissive, treating me like a child who had wandered into adult discussions by mistake. He added that it would be unfortunate if I went around making accusations I could not prove, that defamation was a serious legal matter, and I should be careful about what I said to whom. It was a threat, barely veiled, an attempt to intimidate me into silence. I pulled out my phone and showed them that I had recorded the entire conversation, every word of their conspiracy captured in crystal clear audio. The blood drained from Glenn's face. Derek's expression hardened into something dangerous. Derek took a step toward me, invading my personal space in a way that made my skin crawl, and told me I needed to delete that recording immediately. He said I had no idea what I was getting involved in, that this was bigger than I understood, and smart people knew when to mind their own business. I held my ground, meeting his eyes, and told him that this was exactly my business, since they were planning to defraud my father and destroy my family's company. I said I would be sharing this recording with the appropriate authorities and with my father, and they should both prepare for the consequences. Glenn started to plead then, his voice cracking as he begged me to understand that he needed this money, that his daughter had medical bills he could not afford, that he was desperate. I felt a flicker of sympathy until I remembered that he had options other than fraud, that desperation did not justify destroying other people's lives, that my mother would have helped him if he had just asked honestly instead of plotting behind our backs. I left them on that terrace and went straight back to the lobby, my heart pounding, adrenaline flooding my system. I forwarded the recording to Benjamin Carter with a message saying we had bigger problems than I initially thought, that we needed to move quickly before they had time to cover their tracks. Benjamin responded within minutes, telling me he would contact the authorities immediately and that we should accelerate our timeline for the board meeting. I also sent a message to Margaret Chen and James Reed, warning them about Glenn's involvement and asking them to be prepared for things to get complicated. Then I did something I probably should not have done but could not resist. I went back to the ballroom, found my father in the middle of his happiness, and asked to speak with him privately. He looked annoyed at the interruption, but Vivian was engaged in conversation with some socialite friend, so he followed me out to a quiet corridor. I told him I had information about a serious threat to the company, that people he trusted were planning to steal from him, and he needed to postpone any major financial decisions until we could investigate properly. My father looked at me like I had lost my mind. He asked if I was drunk, if I was trying to ruin his wedding day out of some misplaced jealousy about Vivian. I tried to explain about Derek, about Glenn, about the fake investment fund, but he cut me off before I could finish. He said I was being dramatic, that I had always been too emotional like my mother, and I needed to stop making up conspiracy theories just because I was unhappy about his new marriage. He told me Glenn Morrison was like family, more trustworthy than I would ever be, and Derek was a respected businessman who was doing him a favor by offering access to exclusive investment. Then he said something that finalized my decision about how ruthless I needed to be. He said I was becoming an embarrassment to the Sinclair name, that my behavior tonight proved I was not mature enough to be included in family matters, and maybe it was time I focused on my own life instead of interfering in his. I stood in that corridor and watched my father walk away from me, back toward his new wife and his new life, completely dismissing every warning I tried to give him. In that moment, I understood that I could not save him from himself. He had chosen Vivian, chosen people who were actively plotting against him, chosen everyone except me. So I would do what my mother taught me to do. I would protect what mattered, which was the company my grandfather built and my mother secretly secured. I would protect myself. And I would make absolutely certain that everyone who underestimated me understood exactly how badly they had miscalculated. I left the Plaza Hotel that night and went directly to Benjamin Carter's office in Midtown, where he was waiting despite the late hour. We spent 4 hours going through every document, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy we might need. Benjamin had already contacted a friend at the Securities and Exchange Commission, someone who specialized in investment fraud, and arranged for that person to review the evidence about Derek Walsh's Ponzi scheme first thing Monday morning. We compiled a comprehensive file showing the pattern of fraud, the fake fund documents, the testimonies from investors in Derek's previous failed ventures, and the recording I made on the terrace. It was damning evidence that would almost certainly result in criminal charges. Benjamin also prepared a formal presentation for the board meeting, including verified documentation of my 40% ownership stake, a complete breakdown of every share purchase my mother made, and the trust documents that established my legal control. We discussed strategy for hours, anticipating every possible objection or challenge. Richard would argue that the ownership transfer was invalid somehow, that my mother did not have the authority to purchase shares without his knowledge, that there must be some procedural error we could exploit. Benjamin assured me that every purchase was completely legal, documented, and filed properly with the State Corporation Commission. My mother had used her own money from her family inheritance, money that was legally hers to invest however she chose. She had followed every regulation, never exceeding the disclosure thresholds that would have required public reporting, structuring each purchase through different trusts and investment vehicles in a way that was sophisticated but entirely legitimate. Richard had no grounds to challenge the ownership itself, though he would certainly try to undermine my credibility and claim I was too inexperienced to exercise my voting rights responsibly. Sunday morning, I met with Margaret Chen at her apartment on the Upper East Side. Margaret was 70 years old, a retired executive who had built her own company before selling it and joining various corporate boards as an independent director. She had known my mother since they were both young women navigating male-dominated business spaces in the 1980s, and she had always treated me with the warmth my father lacked. We sat in her elegant living room drinking coffee while I showed her all the evidence about Derek Walsh and Glenn Morrison. Margaret was furious. Not just about the fraud attempt, but about how Richard had allowed himself to be manipulated so thoroughly. She told me she had watched Richard make increasingly poor decisions over the past 2 years, ever since Vivian entered his life, and she had tried to raise concerns with other board members only to be dismissed as being overly cautious or resistant to change. Now she understood that her instincts had been correct, that Vivian was indeed a corrupting influence who brought criminal elements into the company. Margaret made several phone calls right there from her living room, reaching out to other board members she trusted, preparing them for Monday's meeting without revealing too much detail. She was brilliant at corporate politics, knowing exactly how to frame things to get people curious and concerned without making specific allegations that could leak back to Richard. By the end of those calls, she had secured commitments from 3 additional board members to attend the meeting and keep an open mind about what would be presented. Combined with Margaret's vote, James Reed's 20% stake, and my 40%, we had overwhelming control of the board. Richard would not be able to dismiss what I revealed or shut down the investigation into Glenn and Derek. The power dynamics were about to shift in a way that would shock everyone who thought I was just the grieving daughter standing in the corner at the wedding. Sunday afternoon, I met James Reed for lunch at a discreet restaurant in Soho. James was 55, a self-made man who had built his wealth in technology before diversifying into manufacturing and other industries. He owned his 20% stake as a purely financial investment, not because he cared about the day-to-day operations of Sinclair Industries, but he cared very much about protecting the value of his investment. When I showed him the evidence of the planned fraud, his face went from polite interest to intense focus in seconds. He asked detailed questions about Derek's fund structure, about Glenn's role, about the timeline they were planning. Then he made a call to his own lawyers and arranged for them to attend Monday's board meeting as observers, bringing additional legal firepower to support our position. James told me he had suspected something was off when Richard started talking about major portfolio diversification, but he had not wanted to interfere in what seemed like personal financial decisions. Now he realized that Richard's judgment was compromised, and the company needed intervention before real damage occurred. The rest of Sunday I spent preparing myself mentally and emotionally for what Monday would bring. I went to visit my mother's grave in a cemetery in Westchester, bringing white roses and sitting on the grass beside her headstone for over an hour. I told her everything that had happened, everything I had discovered, everything I was about to do. I asked her if I was doing the right thing, if she would be proud of how I was handling this situation, if she had imagined things would go this way when she set up the trust. The wind rustled through the trees, and I chose to interpret that as her answer, as permission to do whatever was necessary to protect what she built. I promised her that I would honor her legacy, that I would not let Vivian and Derek destroy the company, that I would make my father understand what he lost when he chose his new family over his real one. That evening I also did something that felt important for my own closure. I called Glenn Morrison and offered him a choice. I told him he could cooperate fully, testify about Derek's fraud scheme, provide all the internal company documentation that showed the setup for the investment scam, and in exchange, I would advocate for leniency and possible immunity from prosecution. Or he could stay loyal to Derek, go down with the ship when the fraud was exposed, and face the full legal consequences, including prison time and financial ruin. Glenn was silent for a long time, and I could hear him crying on the other end of the line. He finally admitted that he had made a terrible mistake, that he let his resentment and financial stress cloud his judgment, that he never actually wanted to hurt the company or betray my family. He said his daughter really did have medical bills, that he was drowning in debt, and Derek had made it sound so easy and victimless. I told him nothing about this situation was victimless, that his betrayal hurt deeply, but I understood that desperation could make people do things they would never normally consider. Glenn agreed to cooperate, to provide everything I needed, and to resign from his position immediately after the board meeting. Monday morning arrived with perfect autumn weather, sunny but cool, the kind of day that felt appropriate for new beginnings. I dressed in a charcoal gray suit that my mother had helped me pick out years ago for my first big job interview, wearing it like armor as I prepared for battle. Benjamin Carter met me in the lobby of the Sinclair Industries headquarters building at 8:30, giving us time to set up in the 20th floor conference room before the 9 o'clock start. The boardroom was exactly as I remembered from the few times my mother had brought me to the office as a child, all dark wood paneling and leather chairs, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan. Margaret Chen arrived first, giving me an encouraging nod as she took her seat. James Reed came next with his two lawyers, looking serious and ready for confrontation. The other board members trickled in, some looking curious, others confused about why an emergency meeting had been called while the CEO was supposedly on his honeymoon. Richard arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, his face flushed with anger. Vivian trailing behind him in an expensive designer suit that was completely inappropriate for a corporate board meeting. He started talking before he even sat down, demanding to know who had called this meeting, what was so urgent that it could not wait until he returned from his honeymoon, and why his new wife was being treated with disrespect by having security question her right to attend. Margaret calmly informed him that any shareholder with more than 10% ownership could convene an emergency board meeting, and that spouses had no automatic right to attend board meetings unless they were also shareholders or invited guests. Richard looked around the table, his eyes finally landing on me standing near the door with Benjamin, and his expression shifted from anger to confusion to dismissal. He asked what I was doing there, told me this was not appropriate, that I needed to leave so the adults could handle company business. That was when I walked to the front of the room and Benjamin began distributing folders to each board member. I stood at the head of the table, exactly where my grandfather used to stand when he ran this company, and introduced myself formally. I stated that I was Harper Catherine Sinclair, daughter of Richard and Catherine Sinclair, and that I was attending this meeting in my capacity as the majority shareholder of Sinclair Industries. The room went completely silent. Richard actually laughed, a sharp bark of disbelief, and told me I was delusional, that I did not own any shares, that this was some kind of ridiculous stunt. Vivian jumped in, her voice shrill, saying I was clearly having some kind of mental breakdown, and someone should call security to remove me. Derek Walsh, who I had not noticed sitting in the corner as Vivian's guest, stood up and started moving toward the door like he might leave before things got worse for him. Benjamin stepped forward and explained in his calm lawyer voice that every document in the folders proved beyond any doubt that Catherine Sinclair had purchased 40% of Sinclair Industries over a 20-year period, that those shares had been legally transferred to me upon her death, and that all purchases and transfers were properly documented and filed with the appropriate regulatory authorities. He invited anyone who doubted the authenticity to examine the stock certificates, the trust documents, the purchase agreements, all of which bore the official seals and signatures of multiple law firms and government offices. Margaret spoke up then, confirming that she had personal knowledge of Catherine's investment strategy, that she had witnessed some of the purchases and even provided advice on structuring. James Reed added that his own lawyers had reviewed the documents that morning and found them completely legitimate and legally binding. Richard's face went through several colors, from red to white to a sickly gray. He grabbed the folder in front of him and started flipping through pages, his hands shaking, clearly recognizing his wife's signature on documents, seeing the official corporation commission stamps, understanding that this was real. He looked at me with something I had never seen in his eyes before, actual fear, and demanded to know how long I had known about this. I told him I learned about it 6 months ago, after the attorney reading of Mom's will, and I had been watching the company carefully ever since, watching him make decisions that benefited Vivian and her family instead of the shareholders. Vivian started screaming then, calling me a sneaky little snake, saying I had been plotting against them, that this was illegal somehow and they would sue me into oblivion. I ignored her completely and continued with my presentation. I explained to the board that I had discovered a serious threat to the company, that certain individuals had been planning to defraud Sinclair Industries by convincing Richard to invest in a fake fund that was actually a Ponzi scheme. I played the recording I made on the terrace, and the room filled with the sound of Derek Walsh and Glenn Morrison discussing their conspiracy in detail. Every board member leaned forward, listening intently, their expressions growing darker as the full scope of the fraud became clear. When the recording ended, I presented the investigative report on Derek Walsh, showing his history of failed businesses and investor lawsuits, the evidence that his current fund was not properly registered, the testimonials from people he had defrauded in previous schemes. Derek tried to interrupt, claiming the recording was taken out of context, that I was misrepresenting a legitimate business discussion, but James Reed cut him off sharply and told him to be quiet or leave the building. Then Glenn Morrison, who had been sitting with his head in his hands throughout this entire presentation, stood up and addressed the board. His voice was thick with emotion as he confessed everything, admitting that he had been approached by Derek months ago, that he had agreed to help facilitate the fraud in exchange for a commission, that he had been feeding Derek inside information about the company's finances and Richard's decision-making process. He pulled out a folder of his own containing emails, text messages, and financial documents that proved every detail of the conspiracy. Glenn apologized directly to Richard, saying he had let resentment and desperation override his loyalty, that he knew he deserved to be fired and prosecuted, and he was resigning effective immediately. The room was completely silent, except for Vivian's sharp breathing and the sound of Derek Walsh making a move toward the door again. Margaret moved to block Derek's exit, calling for building security through the conference room phone. She stated clearly that Derek Walsh was not to leave the premises until the police arrived, that he was being detained on suspicion of attempted fraud and conspiracy. Derek's smooth facade finally cracked, and he started shouting about harassment, about false accusations, about how his sister's husband was a powerful CEO and there would be consequences for treating him this way. Richard finally found his voice and told Derek to shut up, that Vivian's brother had just tried to steal from him, that he was done being manipulated. He turned to Vivian, who had gone pale and quiet, and asked her if she knew about Derek's plan. She tried to deflect, saying her brother would never do such a thing, that I had clearly fabricated evidence because I was jealous of their happiness. But her voice lacked conviction, and everyone in the room could see the guilt written across her face. The board moved quickly after that. They voted unanimously to suspend any discussion of major asset sales or portfolio restructuring pending a full investigation. They voted to accept Glenn Morrison's resignation and to cooperate fully with law enforcement regarding the attempted fraud. They voted to officially recognize my 40% ownership stake and to appoint me to the board of directors as a full voting member. And they voted, with only Richard abstaining, to make me vice chair of the board with authority to review and approve any financial decisions over $10 million. In less than an hour, I had gone from being the housekeeper my father introduced at his wedding to being one of the most powerful people in the company. Richard sat frozen in his chair, watching his control slip away, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost. After the other board members left, promising to return later that week for a full strategy session, only Richard, Vivian, and I remained in the conference room. Security had escorted Derek to a holding area to wait for the police. Richard looked at me with devastation in his eyes and asked how I could do this to him, how I could betray my own father. The hypocrisy was so stunning that I actually laughed. I reminded him that he had introduced me as the housekeeper at his wedding, that he had erased me from his life, that he had removed me from his will and replaced me with a woman who brought criminals into his company. I told him he lost me as a daughter long before I revealed my ownership stake, that he made his choice when he picked Vivian over everything our family used to be. He had no response to that, just sat there looking old and defeated in a way I had never seen before. Vivian tried one last desperate move, lunging across the table to slap me, screaming obscenities and calling me every vile name she could think of. Security rushed in and pulled her away before she could make contact, and Richard did not even try to defend her or calm her down. He just watched her being removed from the building, probably finally seeing her for what she really was, a gold digger whose mask had completely fallen away. I picked up my briefcase, straightened my suit jacket, and walked out of that conference room feeling lighter than I had in years. The war was not over yet. There would be legal proceedings and investigations, and probably more confrontations, but the major battle was won. I had protected my mother's legacy. I had protected myself, and I had shown everyone who underestimated me exactly what I was capable of. 3 months after that board meeting, Derek Walsh was formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The evidence was overwhelming, not just from the Sinclair Industries case, but from 2 other companies whose executives he had targeted with similar schemes. His fake investment fund was shut down, and investigators were working to recover whatever money they could for the victims of his previous frauds. Derek was looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. Glenn Morrison pleaded guilty to conspiracy and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence of 3 years plus financial restitution. He lost everything: his career, his reputation, his pension, all because he let desperation lead him into criminality. Patricia Walsh, Vivian's mother, was also under investigation for her role in laundering some of Derek's fraudulent gains, though prosecutors were still building that case. The transformation at Sinclair Industries happened faster than I anticipated. I officially took my position as vice chair and immediately began restructuring the executive team, removing people who had been loyal to Richard rather than to the company's best interests. I brought in new talent, younger executives who understood modern markets and were not stuck in the old ways of doing things. I instituted new transparency measures, requiring all major financial decisions to be reviewed by an independent committee before implementation. Stock prices initially dipped when news of the fraud attempt became public, but then rallied strongly when investors saw the new leadership and the commitment to ethical business practices. Within 3 months, our share value had increased by 30%, vindicating the board's decision to give me real authority. Richard and Vivian's marriage deteriorated rapidly once the truth came out. Vivian initially tried to act like she had been deceived by her brother, that she had no idea about his criminal activities, but nobody believed her performance. The recording I made included her voice discussing parts of the scheme, and while that was not enough to charge her criminally, it was more than enough to destroy her credibility. Richard moved out of the penthouse and into a corporate apartment, filing for an annulment on the grounds of fraud in the inducement, claiming Vivian had married him under false pretenses, specifically to facilitate her brother's scheme. Vivian fought the annulment but eventually settled for a modest payout, nothing close to what she would have gotten in a divorce with the prenuptial agreement they signed. She left New York, and I heard through the gossip network that she was in Los Angeles trying to reinvent herself, probably looking for another wealthy mark. My father and I had one final conversation about a month after the board meeting. He came to my new office at Sinclair Industries, looking smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. He asked if we could talk privately, and I agreed, curious what he possibly had left to say. We sat across from each other in my office, the power dynamic completely reversed from every previous interaction we had ever had, and he apologized. He said he had been blind, that he let his grief over losing my mother turn into something ugly and self-destructive, that he pushed away the one person who actually cared about him in favor of people who only wanted to use him. He admitted that calling me the housekeeper at his wedding was the worst thing he had ever done, that he saw the hurt in my eyes and did nothing to fix it, that he chose Vivian's approval over his own daughter's dignity. He asked if there was any way I could forgive him, if we could rebuild some kind of relationship. I looked at this man who gave me life but never really knew how to love me, and I felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to forgive him immediately, to let go of all the pain and anger and just have my father back. But I knew that was not healthy. That forgiveness without accountability was just enabling. I told him that I could not forgive him yet, that forgiveness was something he would have to earn over time through consistent changed behavior, not just words spoken in a moment of regret. I said that he had spent years choosing other people over me, erasing my mother's memory, dismissing my worth, and one apology did not undo all that damage. But I also told him that I was not closing the door completely, that if he genuinely wanted to rebuild our relationship, he could start by respecting my boundaries, respecting my role in the company, and proving through his actions that I mattered to him. He nodded, accepting my terms, and left my office looking thoughtful rather than defeated. I started going to therapy twice a week, working through the trauma of feeling erased by my own father, processing my grief over losing my mother, learning how to set healthy boundaries with people who claimed to love me but treated me poorly. My therapist helped me understand that my worth was not determined by whether my father acknowledged me, that I had value independent of anyone else's recognition. I joined a support group for people who had lost parents, finding community with others who understood the specific pain of grieving someone while they were still alive because the relationship had fundamentally changed. I also started spending more time with Margaret Chen, who became something like a surrogate mother, offering wisdom and support without the complicated history that made my relationship with my father so fraught. One of the most meaningful things I did during this period was establish the Harper Sinclair Foundation, a nonprofit organization funded by a portion of my dividends from Sinclair Industries. The foundation focused on two main areas: supporting women who were leaving abusive relationships and needed resources to rebuild their lives, and providing microloans and mentorship to women who wanted to start their own businesses but lacked access to traditional funding. I named it after my mother because she had taught me that real power was not about control or dominance, but about using your resources to lift others up. The foundation launched with a gala that raised $2 million in its first night, and I felt more proud of that accomplishment than anything else I had done in the business world. I also learned something important about revenge and justice during those months. I had gone into that board meeting wanting to destroy my father, wanting him to feel the pain and humiliation he had inflicted on me. And I succeeded in taking away his control, in exposing the people who were using him, in claiming the power my mother had given me. But revenge did not feel the way I thought it would. It did not make me happy or heal my wounds or erase the years of feeling invisible. What actually helped was building something positive, using my position to make the company better, helping other women through the foundation, creating meaning from the pain. Justice was important, holding people accountable mattered, but it was only the first step in a much longer journey toward healing. 6 months after everything happened, I visited my mother's grave again and told her about everything that had transpired. I described the board meeting, the look on Richard's face when he realized I owned 40% of the company, the satisfaction of protecting what she had built. I also told her about the foundation, about the women we were helping, about finding purpose beyond just winning the corporate battles. I sat there on the grass beside her headstone and finally cried, really cried, letting out all the grief and anger and relief I had been holding inside. And when I finished crying, I felt something shift inside me, like a weight I had been carrying, finally settling into a manageable position. I would never forget what my father did, never stop missing my mother, never be completely free of the pain from those years. But I was learning to carry it differently, to let it inform my choices without controlling my life. I stand now in my office on the 20th floor, looking out at Manhattan stretched below me, and I think about how far I have come from that scared girl standing in the corner at her father's wedding. My phone rings with a call from a young woman who applied for a grant from the foundation. Someone with a brilliant business idea but no family support or access to capital. I answer with a smile and ask her to tell me her story, ready to listen and help in whatever way I can. This is not the ending I imagined when I first discovered my mother's secret gift. I thought it would be about power and control and making people pay for hurting me. Instead, it has become about using that power to create something better, to help people who feel as invisible as I once did, to build a legacy that would make my mother proud. The lesson I learned through all of this is not a simple one about good triumphing over evil or virtue being rewarded. Life is messier than that. The lesson is that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you will fail you completely, will choose others over you, will make you feel worthless, but their failure to see your value does not mean you lack value. It means they lack vision. My mother understood that, which is why she gave me the tools to protect myself. Not just the money, but the example of quiet strength and strategic thinking. She taught me that you do not need someone else's approval to know you matter, that you build your power from the inside out, and that when people underestimate you, that is their mistake to pay for, not yours to internalize. So here is what I want you to take from my story. When people try to make you invisible, prove them wrong, not for their benefit, but for yours. When they dismiss your worth, remember that their judgment says everything about them and nothing about you. And when you finally stand up for yourself, when you claim the power you deserve, do not just use it to tear down the people who hurt you. Use it to build something that matters, something that helps others, something that transforms your pain into purpose. That is real strength. That is real power. That is how you win in a way that actually means something. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been made to feel invisible by your own family? Have you ever discovered strength you did not know you had? Drop a comment below sharing your story, because I promise you are not alone in this struggle. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about people who fought back and won. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are stronger than they think. And remember, your worth is not determined by who acknowledges it. You are valuable simply because you exist, and anyone who cannot see that is missing out on knowing someone extraordinary. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps you write your own ending, one where you are the hero who saves yourself.